In the final episode, to ground Dr. Ligoure's history and lived experience through community memory, we connected with Hal Davidson from Amherst, Nova Scotia. Hal is a town councilor and former deputy mayor, as well as a community historian, researching African Nova Scotian history in the Number 2 Construction Battalion. Hal's great-uncle served in the Number 2 Construction Battalion and later pastored at Disney Chapel Church in Yarmouth. Hal reflects on how this history has been carried through families, faith, and community memory. Stories like Hal's show how the legacy of Dr. Clement Ligoure and the Number 2 Construction Battalion lived on long after the war ended.
Well, I'm glad we're able to do this, Hal. We just actually finished interviewing Mary Beth Sutherland. So you wouldn't know Mary Beth, obviously.
Yeah.
But we had a great conversation. She gave a lot of really good insight. She's a pretty amazing woman. She's doing a lot of great things.
Yeah, I really like listening to her because she gives a bit of a different perspective than what you read about the colonel.
Yeah.
A lot of background information, about the things that he did and.
So Hal, I guess to get started, probably the best thing to do is just kind of talk about who you are, kind of within the African Nova Scotia community. And then I'll get you to probably talk a little bit about your personal connection to Dr. Clement Ligoure, right? But I think it's just grounding in terms of telling about how you're connected to the African Nova Scotian community first, kind of day-to-day stuff. And we'll just start there. Why don't you tell me how you're connected to the African Nova Scotian community first and what community you're from?
Well, I was born in Amherst and lived here pretty much most of my life, except for when I left Amherst to go to university. And I was fortunate enough to get into university at Dalhousie through the transition year program because high school was not my favorite subject.
Right.
And so anyway, I got involved in TYP, as we referred to it. And that got me started off in the university world. And after I graduated from Dal, I went to Carleton University for my master's social work. Worked for a couple of years in Ottawa at the House of Commons and then returned home. Eventually started working in corrections and spent 25 years working for the Correctional Service of Canada. I was appointed to the Parole Board of Canada for 7 years and retired after that. And moved back to my home in Amherst because I was living in Riverview, New Brunswick at the time.
Right.
And I was working for corrections. In our community here, I basically, if anything, just to stay busy, started getting involved in a number of different things. Eventually ran for town council and was fortunate enough to win a seat on the council, and last year did it again, won again.
Oh, wow! Congratulations!
Thank you. But my pastime, I have a few pastimes. Involved in scouting hockey for the Halifax Mooseheads, and but I've also always been very, very interested in local history.
Right.
I was very fortunate to have grown up in a family where my father had a keen interest in local history, in particular local Black history. Very often individuals who would be traveling through that was doing any kind of research would stop by the house and talk to him. He had a lot of different resources and information. And after he passed away in 1982, I kept a lot of his stuff and a few suitcases full of papers and documents and whatnot. So
that seems to be consistent across the board, whether it's a trunk or a suitcase or something to that extent, right?
Yeah. So then I kind of got involved in a number of different things. One thing that I've always been kind of keen on was genealogy. And I've been very fortunate in that my daughter, she's living away. She lives in Japan, but she has a similar interest. So I was feeding a lot of information to her, and she actually was able to do a lot of genealogy work. And through the genealogy work, we've discovered a number of individuals of interest in our past, individuals that Dad may or may not have referred to. One person that I found very, very interesting was Wilfred Jones Davidson, who was a member of the Number 2 Construction Battalion.
Okay.
And I just found that he had a very interesting history. I will point out that when I first heard of the Number 2 Construction Battalion, I was actually at Dalhousie University. It was Rocky Jones that made reference to it.
I remember you mentioning that to me.
Yeah, he did. He was doing a local or Black history and talking predominantly about his great grandfather Jeremiah Jones, who was in the 106 Battalion. And he had also kind of casually made, or probably not casually, maybe I wasn't paying attention enough, but he did. I can't recall him making mention of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. I eventually bought the book, and this is kind of interesting. I have to admit that I bought the book, and I go leafing through, and then I look in the back, and I said, I don't see anything here about Davidson's, because at the back of Mr. Ruck's book, there was a listing of the different members of
all of them. In chronological order. Yep.
Yeah, and by community. Of course, I just looked at Cumberland County.
Right.
I never thought to look in Halifax, and Halifax is where Wilfred Jones Davidson, my great uncle, my father's brother, that's where he was living when he enlisted.
Okay.
And so then I started really digging into what was going on with him when the national apology was being planned for Truro.
Right.
And came up with a lot of information about him and others that were involved in the Number 2 Construction Battalion, especially locally here in Amherst.
Well, you were referenced in Mary's notes as well, right? So I noticed you had a number of ads with regards to the Number 2 Construction Battalion, specifically around the recruitment piece, right? And Hal, I think what's really interesting, I can't go any further without talking about our connection as well, too, that we found out recently talking about this, and specifically around your great uncle, who was a pastor at the Disney Chapel Church in Yarmouth.
Yeah. After he returned, he was a carpenter by trade. And after he returned from the First World War, he was ordained as a minister. I believe he originally was in Sydney, and then he ended up at the Disney Chapel Church and the AME Disney Chapel Church in Yarmouth. And then after that, he was sent to Amherst, where he became a minister at the Highland AME Church. Now, what's really, I find really fascinating about that is that how things go full circle, is that the Highland AME Church was the center of recruitment for the Number 2 Construction Battalion in this area.
Right.
Most likely in other areas as well, but we were fortunate enough with the assistance of the Cumberland County Genealogy Society to go do a review of the newspapers, especially from around July 1916 up to around November of 1916, when the major recruitment process was taking place. And there's all kinds of details that we were able to discover that of how different individuals were recruited. One thing that I really would like to mention is that at one point in time, it was August 31st, 1916, 2 trains arrived in Amherst. One from St. John, and the newspaper reports said there was a couple hundred colored people.
Okay.
Including individuals from Montreal that arrived on that train.
Right.
And there was a train that arrived from Halifax. One train arrived around noon, the other around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They both brought brass bands with them, and they went to what is known as Dickey Park, where they had a large celebration for Emancipation Day. And I always thought that Emancipation Day celebrations, or recognition, if you will, was more of a recent phenomena, but it obviously dates back for several years ago, and certainly it occurred in Amherst. Now, what was really neat about this celebration was the Colonel Sutherland, Reverend White, and a number of other notable individuals participated in it, because they used it as a major recruitment exercise for blacks from all over the Maritimes. And
That
and
band keeps coming up.
yeah. So I just think I just think it was really cool that Amherst had that area, that prestigious opportunity, if you will, to
Right.
host an event such as that and contribute towards the Number 2 Construction Battalion.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. But even you talked about the church, and I think that's one of the things around the recruitment efforts. It's so interesting how the church was all connected through the province here. But like you said, it was a hub to recruit individuals as well, too, right?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, there's even reference to the ladies' auxiliary, or the associated with the church, when they were actually sewing and doing all kinds of things to assist with the men that were going to leave. So everybody was chipping in. The church,
such a small world.
Yeah, the church was the focal point, and as I said, of course, that was in 1916, and I'd like to mention that when I went through my great uncle's attestation papers, and I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit here, but this is important, I think, is that he applied in February of 1916, and he was determined to be medically unfit because he was undersized.
I'm glad you brought that up again.
Okay?
Yeah.
And then he applied again in August. Of course, in July, they made the decision to create the battalion. And he applied in August, and lo and behold, he was medically fit.
Well, so this whole thing around medically undersized, I find that fascinating, right? Like, what does that? What does that even mean? What does that even look like? And and we know the Number 2 Construction Battalion was a construction battalion, right? So it wasn't like they were worried about this. Your great uncle going into battle. He should have been, but this, and I keep going back to some of these practices that were used to keep us essentially out of the military, right? Some people would have just kind of given up, right? But your uncle reapplied, right?
Well, I think a lot of people, like, he wasn't the only one. Let's face it. We fought, or our ancestors fought to fight for their country.
Mm-hmm.
They fought their country to fight for their country, and he was no exception to that. And but it's kind of demoralizing, if you will,
right,
to think that even medical professionals were complicit with the racism.
It's how deep it ran, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point, right? Because when we talk about systemic racism, we don't talk about how entrenched it is. And so one of those things is that Dr. Ligoure's story, of course, he graduated in 1916, became a doctor, but then the ban on allowing Black individuals to pursue their medical degrees happened in 1918. Right. So it was very entrenched, and we often forget about in medicine, and which wouldn't surprise anybody now, our health outcomes and, our dealings with the health system in general. Black people, we've had negative experience, and we continue to still have that.
No, it's representative of what was taking place and what continued on, because, let's face it, racism is not a new concept in our province.
No, it's not.
Definitely not a new concept in our community. I can recall my father being involved. See, my father was he was appointed through the Canadian Labour Congress as the human rights representative for this area.
Okay,
and that was in 1957. And there was a number of different issues that they took on in the area. And included in that was in the early 60s, I think it was in 1960 when they started, and they were able to get it changed in 1961. But they took on the local legion in Spring Hill.
Okay.
And because they had a bylaw
I remember you sharing this.
prevented Black veterans from becoming members. And essentially, when the Canadian Labour Congress, with the assistance of my father, when they wrote the Nova Scotia Legion, and in fact, I thought I'd have it out here to make sure that I quote it properly, because I don't want to go by memory.
I appreciate that.
And their response in 1961, by the Canadian Legion of the British Empire Service League at Nova Scotia Command in Halifax.
Okay.
It said, "It is true that the Springhill branch, under the provisions of its branch bylaws, confines membership to eligible persons of the white race. This is definitely not a matter of discrimination." I'm reading this. I'm not saying it.
Yes.
This is definitely not a matter of discrimination, but a policy to cover a local situation to prevent friction and disunity among your war veterans in the branch area. Now,
Wow.
you know, we're going to be racist to maintain harmony, I guess is what I would
Right.
sum that one up as. So, fortunately, there was a little bit of back and forth, and eventually there was another letter that was received and saying, okay, the bylaw has been removed, and they had asked for my father to ensure a couple of veterans applied to make sure they got in. There's a lot of stories, but I've never seen it actually documented about the racism that was faced by the veterans that came home, and I think there's some similar type stories in the Second World War as well. And then you hear of, I believe there's even a class action suit right now towards the Department of Defense for issues. So it's not just the Number 2 Construction Battalion. I think the Number 2 Construction Battalion was representative of a low point, if you will, of the efforts that were made, not by the federal government per se, because they left it up to the individual commanders, if you will, or of the different organizations in the military. But it was so prevalent, and it continued on, and I think that's why it's so important that we understand this history, and I'm very proud that our community here and our town has been very supportive of some of the efforts that we've had. In the last 2 summers, we erected a monument for the Number 2 Construction Battalion, and we have a storyboard that tells the story about the church and the role of the church, and an individual by the name of Lawrence Martin, who was very, very instrumental in the recruitment process here.
It's really interesting too, and I think one of the things for me is, as we continue on this journey, we start to unpack a lot of this stuff with Dr. Clement Ligoure, but like the perseverance he had, regardless, right? Similar to like what happened to your great uncle, to get denied, right? But then continue on with the recruitment efforts and still have an impact in that way. And then opening up his own private hospital, the Amanda Private Hospital in Halifax later as well too. And he was directly involved with the Halifax explosion as well too, right? So, and I just think it's really amazing in that sense as well too. And I think one of the things too is that somehow at times we forget about this. And so something you said there that made me just kind of reinforce kind of why we're doing this. If you don't know your history, you're going to repeat the mistakes of your past again. And so that's why this is really important that we're doing this, and making sure that we have a community lens on this as well too. Yeah,
well, let's face it, there's still issues of racism that exist in our society. In fact, I think with an individual that's south of the border of us has made it kind of popular as of late. And people are a little bit, people who have kind of repressed their feelings or thoughts feel a little bit more comfortable of coming out with that now. So I think it's very important that we understand that individuals, not just my great uncle, hundreds of individuals, if not thousands of individuals before us, have really paved the way for us to feel comfortable in our own skin to challenge these issues when they come forth, because what we're dealing with right now is pale in comparison of what they dealt with.
Well, we have to remind ourselves that, right, too. And I think we've been able to move things forward a little bit, but it's important for us to know why, down the south, as you would say, that individual's back in, because I think a lot of stuff goes underground. And I think now people have been empowered to kind of speak up about, their beliefs in that sense, but not really understanding the impact on the communities it has had, right? And I think that's the biggest thing, right? And I think it's interesting, the story, the Number Two story, but Dr. Clement Ligoure's story as well too. It's a story of perseverance, but also one of understanding the realities of the political and social climate. And like when you started talking to me about the Legion, one of the things I often talk about is the unwritten rules, but the written rules as well too. We talk about segregated schools as an example, and how segregated schools were impacted our communities, but also in the sense of like being able to actually go to segregated schools that were in churches to learn. And now when the way racism manifests is when you're integrated into actual public schooling systems, it tends to get a little bit worse also too, right? So there's that balance as well too. And I think that's what's really important, is that we continue to make sure that we're highlighting this, because if things continue the way they are, they'll erase all this history. And that's what I'm scared of. Yeah.
No, we definitely, I think we can move backwards in a hurry if we don't maintain, what we're trying to achieve, and one of the real positive things about the national apology, if you will, is that it's just not an apology, that there's a number of activities associated with the apology in terms of ensuring that we have a good, solid understanding of that history and the struggles that individuals went through.
Well, Hal, it's a really good point, because my father, I think I mentioned to you, he was instrumental in getting the monument and exhibit started down in Yarmouth. And we've seen this wave of monuments going across Nova Scotia right now to honor the Number 2 Construction Battalion. But for you, as being a member of the African Nova Scotian community, how empowering was that to see them finally get recognition?
It's one of those... It's really hard to describe. I'm not sure the right adjective or the right phrase to, but there's a sense of pride that we've been able to get it done, and I want to mention that it was when we set up the monument here. There were some people that were resistant to approach the Legion about having the area that was dedicated to be an inclusive area, because their first the Legion's first project was an Afghanistan memorial.
Oh, okay.
Which there was full support for,
right?
And then when we started talking about it being an inclusive property, there was a bit of a resistance in saying, and it ended up, well, Hal, why don't you talk to the Legion?
Right.
And of course you go, well, there were people working on that project. Why didn't they bring it up? But I get, of course, I'll bring it up. And
the only blackface in the room. I get it.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
And so we'll get Hal to do it. But what I found remarkable about it was that after I hadn't even talked about the history of the Legion to the Legion.
Okay.
But soon as we talked about it in the Number 2 Construction Battalion, Justin McKay, the Sergeant of Arms, he was all over it.
Okay.
He says, I know where we can apply. We can get funding here. We can get funding there. And let's do this and let's do this. And he was just all over it. I didn't even have to mention it. And so it wasn't like they were guilted into anything. Like They were on top of it. But what was... some of my colleagues were the ones I was disappointed in. Right. Because they didn't want to have the conversation for whatever reason. But fortunately the Legion jumped all over it, and a strong ally, and And in fact, we do an annual laying of a wreath now at the monument. And the Legion calls me. The last 2 years they called. Hal, you still on for that? Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll get it done.
You're making me think of my father, because my dad was talking about laying the wreaths just recently on Remembrance Day for my great grandfather, but also my great uncle, who's both served in the Number Two, right? And my grandfather as well too, and in World War II. But one of those things I love here, and I want to pick up on this, is you said something there that made me think about how the Legion was on board, but sometimes our own allies that we think are going to show up don't show up in your, and that's what you sometimes have to find those. You have to take risk and find those allies. But I think even from the perspective of the Legion, I think they probably knew they need to reconcile with the community in some way or some capacity, right? They need to have that conversation. Yeah. So I think they are getting to that place where they're trying to, somehow repair trust and build relationships and communities again, right?
Yeah, and I think their activities and not just their words, but their deeds and their support, it's gone a long ways. And it was kind of neat. I suspect it would be the same way when it was in Yarmouth. I was fortunate enough to attend 2 or 3 weeks ago the ceremony in Truro, with the monument in Truro, in the renaming of the field in Truro after the Number 2 Battalion. With all these, people are coming from all over the province.
So these are all these connections through the Number Two and Dr. Clement Ligoure, which is, so impactful, right?
Yeah. And so the connections and going back to the church, and there's another point that I wanted to bring up. The church just wasn't obviously about the Number Two, because the church was the center, if you will, for the Old Colored Hockey League.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Because most of the hockey teams were based out of churches. And we had the Amherst Royals here. We had the Halifax Eurekas.
Okay.
And my great uncle, his brother, my grandfather, he played on the Eurekas.
Interesting.
Okay. So,
I love that.
And a lot of the Number 2 Battalion members played either for the hockey and the Old Colored Hockey League, and there was also the challenges for Maritime Championship of what they called the Maritime Color Championship for baseball.
Take a moment here to have this conversation around the church, right? And how that pillar, and we see this more and more. We talk to all the communities. It wasn't just a pillar in terms of, religion and spirituality, but it was like a safe haven, a place where you could go to do sports, education, all these multifaceted things that you could do there, right? But that created a huge sense of community and connection, right? And I think when Dr. Clement Ligoure came here, he must have been like, this is amazing. This is kind of where I can go recruit. But he built community in there as well too. He was able to establish a hospital, the Atlantic Advocate, all of those interesting things. My question here to you, Hal, and we've talked, I love talking to you. And this is one of the questions I want to ask you is, do you think that, we talked about where we are currently now in terms of times, but we've kind of moved away from the church being a pillar in our community at times. Do you see that as impacting kind of African Nova Scotian culture in that sense?
I absolutely. And then unfortunately, the Highland Amy Church is no longer in the town of Amherst. So most people of color, most Black people have moved on to other churches, if they're still actively involved with churches. But to your point, I recall as a child, the church, again, being the center point of our community. We go to Sunday school in the morning, there'd be church in the morning. In the afternoon, we'd be playing baseball, and everybody from the community would be going to the ball field.
Right.
People from, 8-10 years of age up to probably 80 years of age. It was youth adults all playing ball together. We're having our own fun and that kind of thing. In the summertime,
all of those
there was
things.
the
Yes.
summertime, we had the annual trip when they would bring they bring the bus in, and they would take us to Heather's Beach.
Okay.
We didn't have cottages.
Right. Yeah.
So,
No
that
kidding.
was one of our annual treks to the beach, and, like all fun and games and that type of thing. But at the same time, you had the church with the missionary, and I don't, I have it here somewhere anyway. I actually have the minutes from the missionary of the Highland AME Church from the 1960s.
Okay.
And every week that when they would get together, they would there'd be prayer, song, and then in the minutes they would be talking about how they'd be doing fundraising or trying to assist people that were not doing so well.
Right.
In fact, you've heard of Frenchie's Used Clothing.
Right.
Well, we were doing that back in the 60s. There was actually, the church had a used clothing store in Amherst. And up on the hill where most of us lived, and that was a place where people could go get cheap clothing. Okay, a lot of people were not as wealthy. We all lived up in the same area at that time, and there were certain things we just wouldn't do. We didn't go to the golf course. There was no signs there saying blacks are not allowed, but I think it was understood. I recall going home not going home, but after Sunday school, we'd go up and we'd get in a line and go to a place at a home and have our hair cut.
Right.
Because we couldn't get our hair cut downtown. I remember my father telling me about who the first barber was, to a guy by the name of Alex Cameron, who was the first white barber downtown that would cut a black person's hair.
That's not too long ago. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so there was lots of things going on. Like the minstrel shows that the service clubs were bringing in, and those were being held in minstrel shows being held in churches.
Right.
Not our church, obviously, but and what a degrading way. The school books that we had, that talked about Bunga and Simba and all that type of stuff.
That's came up before. I've heard that, right? And
yeah, I can still, I don't have one of them, but there was a geography book. It was green, and I don't know if it was grade 4 or grade 5, and it said, look around your room. You may see some people with naughty steel wool hair and big flat noses and big lips, and we'd be banging our head trying to hide underneath the desk.
Do you know who was talking to me about that? It was Lynn Jones.
Yeah, well, Lynn would know about that. I went to TYP with Lynn.
You went to TYP, and I remember my dad referencing that as well too, right?
Yeah.
Worried about being in class and having somebody look at you, right? Or reach over. Wow.
I distinctly remember, the teachers, and it was in the book. Look around your room.
Look around your room. Wow.
So a lot of those different types of things that were occurring, that's why it resonates with me. And people say, well, how come you get so offended when you see a racist symbol or you hear of some racism? And I'm saying, after you lived it for all your life, even though it's not at the level that what my father and my great uncle and his father and all of our ancestors have dealt with, it still resonates.
Yeah, absolutely does. It manifests differently. I try to remind people it's not about overt acts of racism. It's the daily acts of racism. And I often say, as African Nova Scotians, or more broadly Black people, we're exposed to racism on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And you think it from a historical context as well too, what it would have been like. I kind of chuckled to myself because the lines were drawn a little bit differently there. You knew where not to go and what not to do. Here it's blurred, so you don't know where you're going to walk into sometime, right?
Yeah. So to your point earlier, the perseverance of individuals like Dr. Ligoure.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It really is. It's amazing how they just continue to work their way through and still do the things that they ended up doing and how they contributed towards our community. I don't know if Mary Beth mentioned to you, she had mentioned to me that Dr. Ligoure was her great-grandfather's first choice.
He was, yeah, but and she mentioned that he was the first choice to become chief medical officer, and then he wrote a really strong recommendation, and we actually read that, and then he was denied, right? So it talks about those practices and policies that are in place at a higher level, right? That you don't have control over at times, right?
Yeah. And then we ended up, he wasn't, and I want to make clear, he wasn't the one that did my great uncle's medical, but the medical officer was Anne Murray's grandfather.
That's why I heard that. Yeah, Anne Murray's grandfather. That's interesting, right? All these connections, right?
But he ended up taking on and going overseas with the battalion.
Well, one of the things too is we know what when your great uncle came back, and you said your great uncle was a pastor, but was he involved with? Did you say construction as well too when he came back?
Well, he was a carpenter.
Carpenter. Yeah,
he was a carpenter by trade before he was ordained as the minister, and he didn't live that long. He passed away in 1931.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. He had a heart attack, passed away, and he had two funerals. There was one in Amherst, and the minister from the Anglican Church spoke at his funeral in Amherst, and Reverend White spoke at his funeral in Halifax.
Okay. Small. Yeah. He had an impact as well too, right? I think that's the whole thing.
They were all connected, obviously. Even back then, and it's anyway. It's just we keep going full circle. I might even. I was looking at some information this morning before getting ready for the podcast after I get back, and I was noticing I hadn't picked up on it before, but my great grandfather, who would be Wilford Jones's father and my grandfather's father.
Okay.
The woman he married was a Smith, by the way.
Oh, God. Oh, jeez. We're probably connecting. And then this is the thing. Like I said, it's one of the best things for me. I find it therapeutic having these conversations. Like stuff you're sharing to me, Hal, like about what Amherst was like, about, growing up and things of that nature. And you said something about the golf course and not knowing. He said, okay, well, we know not to go to the golf course. But in Yarmouth, my dad talks about the stories from my grandfather and him not passing Forest Street at 6 p.m. because he knew if he was past Forest Street at 6 p.m., he would get either 1A thrown in jail or he'd get ran out of there, right? So all these unwritten rules in our community at that time. And I think people, like in context, you have 1916, 19 to like 1918, but then fast forward to 1960s, 50s and 60s, there wasn't a lot of change. There's still those practices that were embedded, right?
Yeah. No, a lot of different practices, and even you mentioned the 60s. I'll bring you up to the 70s and early 80s.
Segregated schools.
Billy Rowley, the third black to play in the NHL, first African Nova Scotian playing in the NHL. He bought a cottage.
Okay.
He had to go to court to get it.
What do you mean?
They didn't want to give him the cottage, and there was no other reason other than the color of his skin. But he was fortunate that the manager and the owner of the Rambler team that he had played for when he played junior hockey here was a lawyer and represented him, and he was able to secure it. But he had to go to court to get the actual cottage.
Lord, wow. Isn't that something, right? I mean, it's so much a redlining, right? They probably wanted to keep him out of that area. So, they didn't want to have the first black family have a cottage in that area or something to that extent, right? So, Hal, you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier as well too, but like the significance of the story and why this story is important, right? You talked about knowing your past and moving on, but is there anything you'd like to share on why this story is so important and impactful?
Well, I think that there's probably a number of layers to it to unpackage, but one of the things is that we didn't study this history when I studied history, and I don't think that a lot of the kids are studying this history today. And when we look at our youth that are coming up, who are the role models? And, you know, it's with social media, it's a little easier these days, obviously. However, you know, like we don't understand, a lot of people, if you don't understand where you're coming from, okay, it makes it very, very difficult to forge the path going ahead. And I'm not suggesting, you know, I always use the analogy of there's a reason why the rear view mirror is a lot smaller than the windshield. It's because we're not going that way. But we want to make sure that we have that reminder. It's very important for us to have the reminder, and I think you mentioned earlier, because we will make some of the same mistakes of what we either tolerate it or what we put up with or what we just turned a blind eye to.
I don't think I just said it any better than that. You know, and I just think, you know, you said about youth, and I think about how impactful this would have been if I had have known this story when I was in school. Maybe I would have went on to try to get into the medical profession, right? I mean, and we had this conversation, like, what if we knew about this? And I think when we talk about identity more broadly, but the importance of knowing your history, because then you're able to draw lines and connections and know that, hey, this individual did this. And, you know, Dr. Clement Ligoure, he died when he was 34. He did all of these things at a relatively young age. This was an exceptional individual, right? And I should also say it's doing a disservice not to other communities to not know this story, right? Because you're not getting an accurate depiction of it.
And my understanding is that in a lot of our traditional Black communities, you know, there's a little bit of mistrust between individuals and that type of thing. And as long as we're not working together, it's going to make things a lot more difficult. And for people that don't want to see the progress, they're quite happy to see the mistrust and seeing there being disunity in our communities.
It's the design of the construct. They want to see us fighting back and forth, right? So it's important that we start having more conversations about solidarity, right? How we can work together.
And the Number 2 Construction Battalion is bringing us together now. You know, when we had the ceremony, I have actually a photograph up here of the ceremony. I don't know if it'll show up here. This individual here in the blue suit, Brian Paris.
Okay.
Sylvia Paris's brother, Brian Paris. His father's on the stamp for the Number 2 Construction Battalion. Brian and I went to TYP together.
So Hal, is there anything you'd like to leave us on in closing? This has been great.
Well, first of all, I'm very, very happy that we've met by phone and finally get to see each other and that type of thing. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of dialogue going forward.
For sure.
You know, I'd like to try to plan sometime to get down to Yarmouth with you. And because I haven't had a chance to get down, I want to get down and see the Disney Chapel Church and all that and keep expanding things. But I think now it's a time to try to get a lot of these things down on paper and having all these documents well preserved so that the youth and people that come after us have a better understanding than what we did when we were growing up.
Well, you want to make it more accessible, right? I think that's the biggest thing, right? And that's the purpose of all of this project, but more in general, like the digitizing of this stuff. We were just talking to Mary Beth about that as well too. We need to digitize this stuff so it can be accessible.
Yeah, that I think that's the most important thing. I don't take great delight when I hear people doing private research and they don't want to share their documentation. Anything I have, I'm an open book. Anything I discover, I love getting it out there. I just think it's important to tell the story.
Absolutely.
And with what you're doing, I think that just adds to it.
The more access to these stories, the better. That's the way I approach these things. And I think at the end of the day, if we have to take accountability for our own history too, because if we leave it in the hands of other individuals, we're going to be waiting a long time, right?
Yeah, and when you live up in this neck of the woods, okay, we always say Nova Scotia stops at the toll booth there and at the pass.
At the Cobequid Pass.
Yeah, and that's our favorite saying up here. But then, I remember talking to Russell Gross, and I said, you know what? I'm really going to try to get some stuff together up there because it's no good me pointing fingers saying that everybody else isn't doing it.
Yep.
Let's take control of our own destiny because you know what? Dr. Ligoure, Wilfred Jones Davidson, and all the other individuals that we talked about, they carved their own path. They didn't wait for someone else to do it for them.
Oh, I think we're going to end on that note. That's going to be a great clip. All right, brother. You have a great one. All right, Hal. Take care. See ya.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Clement Ligoure podcast. The Dr. Clement Ligoure podcast is made with the support of the John Bragg Award in partnership with Association of Nova Scotian Museums, Africville Museum, and the Black Cultural Center. The podcast aims to educate, preserve, and deepen our understanding of African Nova Scotian heritage while highlighting the stories of individuals who have shaped Atlantic Canadian history.